Okay, today is February 24, 2014, Forensic Interviewing of Children. We're just beginning Learning Module 4. And one of your first readings is Chapter 15, which is a scanned copy of a chapter by Wendy Bourg. And it's a chapter about suggestibility in children. As I just mentioned a moment ago, if you look at the learning objectives for each learning module, you'll pretty much have a map for what I think is important for you to understand when you're done with that learning module. And this learning module is all about the impact of investigative behavior upon children's memories, or to say it differently, suggestibility. Now, Bourg, that's the author of what you're seeing on the big board now. Bourg tells us that memory refers to three basic processes, and this is something that you ought to pay attention to and acquire as I offer it to you, and that is acquisition. The first act of memory is acquisition of memory. You experience something, you acquire that memory, it's then stored, and then lastly, if necessary, it's retrieved. So those are the three basic processes of human memory and children's memory, of course. Acquisition, storage, and retrieval. All three processes are refined with age, which means we get better at it as we get older. And then as you get really older, it begins to degrade. Certainly latency age children, grade school age children, are better at acquiring, storing, and retrieving memories than preschoolers. And then high schoolers are better at, generally speaking, acquiring, storing, and retrieving memory than grade school kids. Once children reach the age of about 12, just out of their grade school years and approaching their high school years, they become no more suggestible than adults. The point, though, is all three processes of memory are refined or get better with age. And once you reach 10 or 11, you are no more suggestible than an adult. Having said that, even adults are suggestible. All people are suggestible. And we need to minimize suggestibility whenever we interview somebody. We want to get to as much of the historical truth as possible without undermining or influencing or changing or corrupting that memory through our behavior or our questions. Suggestibility refers to the likelihood of changing memories or a person's report of memories by exposing them to biasing influences, such as leading questions, inaccurate information, or a coercive interview. Now, there are a variety of ways that someone can be suggestible in an interview. These are just a few that Professor Bourg highlights. Leading questions, inaccurate information, or a coercive interviewer. To look at it even more broadly, we can influence children by our language and our behavior. The things we say and how we say it, right? That's what communication's all about. Communication is really two-part process. What we say and how we say it. And I know that one of you, well, even one of the guys, mentioned it in your discussion board postings. You mentioned about how an interviewer's behavior could influence a child in some way, and also how it's not what we say but how we say it. I characterize that as well, I don't characterize it. The literature on linguistics characterizes that as meta messages, or the message behind what's said. For example, you're not going to eat that candy, are you? There's no candy in front of her, but the point is, the manner in which I said you're not going to eat that candy said something different than simply the words you're not going to eat that candy. The words you're not going to eat that candy seem to be a rather neutral question about whether she's going to eat it or not. But the way I said it suggested what? That it's not a good idea to eat the candy. right? I was weighing in about my personal opinion as to whether she should eat that candy or not. What's interesting, as a longtime litigator, a lawyer in the courtroom, nowadays much of what's recorded in the courtroom is done through video cameras and audio, although in some trials we still use a stenographer. Well, when the case was over and the jury was deliberating, the jurors would often have questions. And sometimes they would say, I want to hear John Carmelo's testimony again when he talked about dragging the girl into the dorm room. Well, the court reporter would go get the machine and search around for the area where the witness, John Carmelo, talked about dragging the woman into the dorm room. And the reporter would read it to the jury. We called that readback. But as a lawyer, I'd sit there, and I'm sure the other lawyer felt the same way, and we'd say, man, that's not how he said it, though, you know? And the court reporter is trained to be very neutral. Question, did you drag the girl into the room? Answer, yes. Question, was she sober or not or drunk? Answer, I don't remember. Question, you know, very neutral and boring, if you will, because none of that meta information is coming out. None of that behavior, none of that tone, none of that inflection was coming out, which matters so much in communication. So a lot was lost with the court reporter. Now, if it was in my favor, I'd be like, yeah, I'm glad they didn't see the look on his face when he said that. I would think to myself. Or if it was against me, I'd be disappointed that the jury couldn't see the look on his face the way the reporter read it. Nevertheless, the point is, it's not only what we say, it's equally important how we say it. And an interviewer can be suggestive either through leading questions or inaccurate information or a coercive interview through the words that they use, but also through their behavior and their relationship with the child in the interview room. Professor Bourg also introduces us to a concept known as trace strength. Trace strength. And what she means by that is it's the accuracy of that acquisition process. The acquisition process is, you know, when you experience something, how that information is taken into your brain and encoded or stored, right? And children's trace strength can be different than adults' trace strength because sometimes children might be focused on something that's completely different from what the average adult would focus on. Okay, what may be salient or relevant to an adult may not be relevant or salient to a child. You know, often we're asked to identify who a person is, where an adult would probably focus on what? What would the adult focus on if you said, what did the guy look like that grabbed your purse?
The face.
The face, right?
The skin color.
The skin color, the face.
Race.
What they're wearing.
Race, what they're wearing.
Their height, their weight.
Right, all these physical attributes. Whereas a child might say he looked mean or say he had funny socks. You know, the child might be focused on the socks because that's what caught their interest, or some other aspect of the experience that is different from what the adult might have been focused on. And, you know, that doesn't make it right or wrong or good or bad. It just means that we have to realize that what's relevant and interesting to kids might be different than that which is relevant and salient to adults. As Bourg points out, children may attend to different aspects of an event than adults. The color of a person's socks and shoes versus the color of hair and eyes. Children also tend to be less attentive than adults. There's a fancy term here called trace decay. It simply means forgetting. Okay? Memory storage improves with age. I said that at the beginning. Storage problems are often referred to as trace decay. Bourg points out that numerous studies indicate that as time passes, the reports of both children and adults are less complete and less accurate. Right? Is that surprising? As time goes by, people forget stuff. But here's what's important. Unfortunately, children forget more quickly than adults. And the younger the child, the faster the rate of forgetting. Now, here's something that's a little bit controversial, but I think it's important, especially for forensic interviewers. And that is, there is this hypothesis that there are two memory systems at work when we experience something. So if we saw someone punch someone in the nose in a cafeteria and his nose began to bleed, right? That's something we experienced, we observed, and we developed a memory for. Okay? Now, the theory is that there's two memory systems operating here. One is a verbal memory. You know, I saw the man's fist hit the other man's nose. I saw blood come out. It was red. It trickled down his face and got on his shirt. You know, we remember it with words. And there's another kind of memory, okay, that's a sensory memory. Part of our brain stores the excitement of the moment, the crash of the fist against his nose, the scream that he uttered. Right? The noise that surrounded the punch in the nose from the people who were in the cafeteria or in the student center with everybody else, yelling and jumping and the chairs falling over as someone tried to break it up. You know, there's one memory that takes it in words and another memory that takes it in your senses, a sensory memory. And while there's some, I wouldn't call it controversy, but this hasn't completely been proven, it makes sense to a lot of people who study human memory, and that is this second memory system that is sensory. She's talking about the verbal memory as second, but one verbal memory and sensory memory. And later on, I'm going to talk to you about props, and we mentioned props a couple of weeks ago. What kind of prop might we use in a forensic interview that might take a child back to time and place in a different way than simply asking her with words or him with words? By prop, I mean something we bring in the interview room with us to help us talk to kids. Yeah, anatomical dolls may tap into sensory memory, and I'll show you video clips of how the information that you get with anatomical dolls is different from the information that you get simply by asking questions. And to the extent that there is this phenomenon known as sensory memory, dolls, by replicating the people and the behavior in 3 dimensions in a very sensory way through the use of the dolls, may tap into that kind of memory and get different kind of recollections. We'll talk more about that later. I remember when I was in football practice as a high schooler, and I used to hate practice to begin with. But the practice at the beginning of the football year was the worst kind of practice. It was in the summer, it was hot, and you weren't even in pads, and you would do triple sessions or double sessions. You do twice or 3 times the practice, and my memories are not only of the coach yelling and of going through obstacles and blocking sleds and doing all this kind of stuff, but I also remember the tone of the coach's voice, and the smell of the cut grass lingers with me. And to this day, when I smell that freshly cut grass, it triggers in my mind recollections in a very distant way of those triple sessions. Somehow I equate that fresh cut grass, maybe because my face was buried in it half the time, with the recollection of these traumatic memories, these football practice memories. The point is, you can remember in a sensory way, you can remember in a verbal way as well. It is important to note that the hypothesis that some memories are stored non-verbally is controversial at the present time. And there's research that kind of goes both ways. Obviously, 2 and 3-year-olds have not acquired language, so their memories are exclusively nonverbal. Professor Bourg makes the observation that because children, especially preschoolers, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, have not lived the full life that adults have lived, they're missing important components that connect one memory to another, or a connection between a question you may have and a memory. It is more difficult to cue children's memories because they don't have enough life's experience. Excuse me. Now, here's something that I want you to remember, and that becomes important. It's recognition memory versus recall memory. Excuse me, which I've written in the margins of that page. And you should remember this. There's 2 general kinds of memories now. We've talked about nonverbal and sensory memory. But more importantly, and that's a bit controversial, more importantly, I want you to think of memories, think about memory in terms of recognition memory and recall memory. And I'll explain what that is in a moment. This is directly related to forensic interviewing and what we do and how to ask questions. Because you'll use different kinds of questions to tap into recall memory than you will to tap into recognition memory. Now, Bourg says recall involves spontaneous production of a memory with minimal cueing. Cueing means kind of orienting the person to what you're interested in hearing about, either through questions or even with a prop. I'll say it a little bit differently. Recall memory is that memory that a person can recall without any cues or prompts. It's the kind of memory that happens when we say, tell me everything that happened yesterday, or tell me everything that happened on the ride here, or tell me everything that happened at the football game. Minimal cueing. Football game is a cue. The ride here is a cue. But it's minimal, just a little bit of cueing. Free recall memory, or recall memory, is that memory that a person can give spontaneously without help, without a lot of cues and prompts. And cues and prompts can be words and questions. All right? Back to my hypothetical in the lunchroom, a man punches another man in the nose and there's blood. I might say, did you have lunch today? I did. Tell me everything that happened during lunch. Does that call for recognition memory or free recall memory? No. Free recall, not recognition. Free recall. I didn't even explain recognition yet, but that calls for free recall memory. Tell me everything that happened today when you had lunch. I start out with, did you have lunch today in the cafeteria? I did. Tell me everything that happened during lunch today. It's usually a broad question, open-ended, where the person being asked the question is going to give a narrative with minimal cues and prompts. Cues and prompts mean help, if you will, focusing on what the questioner wants to hear, okay, and prodding your memory. That's what a cue or a prompt is. To describe it even better, I hope, I'll change the question around. You'll see what I mean by cues and prompts. A pile of freshly cut grass could be a prompt for me if you wanted to ask me about football practice, because it's a cue. It's something that's helping me remember. So a cue or prompt can be words, and it generally involves words, but it can also be a doll. It can also be a walk to the certain place. It could be any kind of thing in the human world that jogs the memory. So free recall is memory that's produced with minimal cues and prompts. Tell me all about your lunch today in the MSU cafeteria. All I did was tell you lunch, cafeteria, and you're going to give me a narrative. Tell me everything that happened when those two guys got in a fight and one guy bled on the other. Now I'm tapping into recognition memory. The reason I'm tapping into that is I'm giving you information about what I'm interested in. Information to cue, right? To cue your memory or prompt it or help you remember. So what are some examples of the words that I gave you that give you more focus?
Fight.
Fight. Very good. What else? Blood. There you go. Okay. What was it? Lunch. So I gave you 3 prompts. I got you in the lunchroom. I'm focusing on people fighting and that there was blood. Okay? That taps into recognition memory. Recognition memory is the kind of memory that's produced with multiple cues or prompts. So recall memory is that amount of memory that a human can produce simply by asking them what happened, so to speak, with minimal cues or prompts. What happened in the cafeteria today? Recognition memory is the kind of memory that's produced when someone reminds you of the event in some way. And the reminding is what we call cueing or prompts, cues or prompts. I'd like to think of recognition memory based upon its root. The root of recognition is what word you would say? What's the first part? Recognize. Excellent. So the methodology here is getting you to recognize the event through some kind of cue, some kind of prompt, some kind of clue, C-L-U-E rather than cue. Here we identified the recognition prompts as blood, fight, lunchroom. The ideal interview is one that is loaded with free recall memory and less recognition memory. Not that there's anything wrong with recognition memory. In fact, very often we need to tap into recognition memory because the interviewee, in most cases the child, is not focused on what we think is relevant to our inquiry. So we use recognition memory a lot, but ideally, free recall memory is the best. And by best, I mean it's the kind of memory that is most accurate. It is the kind of memory that's least likely to be wrong or have errors in it. They've done studies, and free recall memory, or recall memory, you may hear me call it free recall as well. Free recall memory is more accurate than recognition memory. The problem is with real little kids, you can't get much with free recall memory. So you're going to have to work on recognition memory. You're going to have to cue them and prompt them. There's no way around it. Nevertheless, whenever we use a leading question or a suggestive question or a question that has information to act as a cue or prompt, we need to follow it up with an open-ended or a free recall question. And you'll learn more about that later on in the course. Simply because I said studies have been done that show that recall memory is more accurate than recognition memory, again, doesn't mean that recognition memory is bad. Imagine, if you will, and these aren't the numbers at all, they studied kids and they concluded that when you ask questions of children with free recall memory, 96% of the time they are generally accurate. When you use recognition memory, 88% of the time they're accurate. Well, with those numbers, free recall memory is more accurate than recognition memory. But that doesn't mean recognition memory isn't good memory too. Almost 8 out of 9 times you're going to get good memory error-free memory. Again, I'm just throwing those numbers out there just to make the point that recognition memory isn't necessarily bad. It just tends to be less accurate than free recall memory. And accuracy is critical when you're deciding whether somebody ought to lose their kids or have a disruption in their parenting or go to prison. There is a process that police officers, detectives for the most part, engage in with witnesses in many cases that is a perfect example of recognition memory. It is an attempt to tap into recognition memory. And although most detectives probably don't have any idea they're tapping into this kind of memory that's been identified by researchers and by academics, they use it all the time because it helps people remember. Can someone give me an example of what I might be referring to, what police officers do with victims of crimes? That's designed to tap into recognition memory. You can ask the victim of the crime, tell me about when that guy you didn't know grabbed your purse and beat you down. Tell me everything. That would be a free recall memory. And they may tell you something and it may be real accurate. Go ahead.
I know it was a question, but I was going to say the police lineup. Would that be?
That's a perfect example of recognition memory. When they give you a group of images, they used to do lineups. No one does lineups anymore. Maybe in some precinct in New York City they still do it, but it's very rare. They do photos. And nowadays with computers, you can make these photo arrays in an infinite number of ways. But yes, that's one way. Now way we do it is we get, let's say, 10 photos, and we have to deal them like a deck of cards. And research has shown that this is the most reliable way to tap into recognition memory. You're trying to see if they recognize the man who attacked them and took their purse and beat them down. So that's exactly right. The way we do it now, though, is you get the pictures like a deck of cards, and you hand them out, and it's very specific. It goes something like this: don't say anything, victim. If you see the guy among them, don't say anything till I'm done. And just because I'm showing you this group of pictures doesn't mean that the guy who did this to you was among them. He or she may or may not be there. Don't assume that we caught the guy. When you see the person, just make a note of it in your mind. I have to deal all the cards, and we deal all the cards. And then we say, do you see? Yes, he was the fifth guy. Okay, I'm going to deal them again. You tell me when to stop. That's him. Okay. And then they identify him. Good example of recognition memory. Give me another thing that detectives do. Woman's walking home to her car. Walking to her car here at Montclair State. She's bopped on the head. Her purse is taken. The guy yells something to her. She got to look at him. He runs off in the distance. Okay? And it happened in the parking deck. How many levels are in this parking deck? 7. It happened on level 7 in the back corner. Okay? One thing we may do that taps into recognition memory, don't mean to scare you folks.
You're going to take her to the scene, right?
There you go. Take her to the scene. Take her to the scene. What's the point of going to the scene?
To recall what happened.
Yeah, right? I mean, you can't get any more recognition memory than that, right? The police are doing that because they think by seeing the environment in which the events occurred might jog the victim's memory and they get more details. They may not have known it, but they were tapping into recognition memory and, to a lesser extent, sensory memory. You know, the smell, the way it felt, the narrow of the passageway to get where you were going, the fact that the corner is isolated. You know, all that stuff that is nice. It's not the product of words. It's a product of a feeling that one gets when they go to the place that it happened at.
And I say,
of course.
I play games on my phone.
Yeah.
Like I hope we all do. And there are a lot of games, a lot of apps now that took memory.
Yeah, I've seen some of those.
Building Your Memory, Luminosity, and I play a couple of them. And as you're talking, there are pieces of games or puzzles that I have to put these blocks together.
Right.
And as you're talking, I realized that, I'm using my sensory memory and all these memories to try to do these games because I don't know how to put a puzzle together initially. When I look at it, certain things trigger. It's like I might feel might feel frustrated, like, oh, I need to do this, and then I start to put piece, and then I start to put piece, another piece, and then I end up figuring it out.
Right, and I imagine there's a certain feeling you get when context changes. When something's here and something's there, that triggers that something belongs here.
And the more I do it, I mean, when I go back to the game,
right,
I realize that's how I'm being programmed to know how to, play the game better every time. Yeah.
When I don't know, maybe about 10, 12 years ago, there was that was more longer than that perhaps. It was before there were dorms. There's a road that runs behind the university, I don't know where I'm sitting here, called Clove Road, and it empties out by the diner, the Six Brothers Diner on Route 46. Before there were dorms, there were Clove Road apartments, and they were like quasi-dorms. There was all student housing, but they were small apartments, a bunch of them right on Clove Road. And I had a case where a student here and his buddies had picked up a 15-year-old girl at Willowbrook Mall who was doing surveys. I don't know if they do them that much anymore, but every now and then you walk through the mall and there's somebody with a clipboard and they make, $5 for every survey they complete or whatever. And this girl, I guess, had convinced them she was older and she was doing a survey. They invite her back to the Clove Road Apartments. They were going to get Jets tickets at the Willowbrook Mall. They have a ticket sales over there. And there was 4 or 5 guys, the girl that they invited to this party, and 2 girls, I don't know if they were students or not, but 2 adult women, maybe 19 or 20, all under the drinking age. And they got the girl intoxicated, the 15-year-old. And they came up with this scam where they invited her to walk around the track. They said, listen, we don't think you can, the men there, and I use that term disgustedly, the men there said to her, we don't think you can finish the rest of that 151 rum, which is powerful rum, and it was some left in the bottle, more than enough. You can suck that down, chug it, whatever you want to call it, and then go walk around the track. And she's like, oh, yes, I can. And the girls who were there, as youthful as they were, saw that this was an ominous set of events that was unfurling before them. And they were like, don't do it. No, I can do it. I can do it. And then the girls were then yelling at the guys, that's not cool what you're doing. We know what you're up to. And they're like, shut up. And they also drank something I've never heard of until I began prosecuting this case, with all due respect to this liquor. Alizé.
Oh, come on.
That is old. I don't know. I never had it, but it seemed to be kind of a syrupy. I don't know what it is, but
It's like a liqueur.
they had Alizé and 151, and they were drinking it.
That's a
And
bad
they, that's a what?
It's a bad mix, by the way.
He was drinking Incredible Hulk.
Yeah.
It was a bad mix, and
Blackout.
they then tell the girl, come on, we're gonna walk. 3 guys, the girl. They walked from Clove Road down a dirt path past the radio station tower, which is still there, and they were heading towards where now they're putting up a business center or something. They were heading towards the track to, ostensibly to walk around the track. Well, she only made it about a third of the way down the dirt path. She hit the dirt, cut her head, began to bleed, and then began to vomit. So as she lay there in vomit and blood, semi-conscious, with her mouth into the dirt, I remember telling the jury, they decided they might as well take off all of her clothes and have sex with her lifeless body, and that's what they did. Anyway, they get arrested, we find them, she disappears. It was one of the few cases that I ever tried with no victim. I never met her, she never came to court. All I had were her little mud jeans. And I had her dad, I flew her dad, I didn't fly her, the county flew her dad in from Texas to identify her photo and her jeans. He knew the jeans, and ironically, they were Mud was the brand, and they were full of mud and other vomit and yuck. But I brought them there to show, I had to make this person, three-dimensional to the jury. They're like, why are we here? No victim. And I had to cut a deal with one of the guys, two of them actually, to testify against the two who had molested her most intrusively. And in preparing for trial, and the lieutenant that I worked with at the time is now your chief here, Paul Sell. He was a lieutenant at the time. And I worked with Paul and a couple of his other detectives. And we took the girls, they got charged with hindering apprehension because they lied to the police. They did a couple things they shouldn't have, but they were good kids. They got a free pass in the end. But, we held the prosecution over them because, that's the way the world works. I mean, I needed their testimony. And they were charged, but they were also my witnesses. So what I did was bring them here to the scene. And you'd be surprised at how much additional information I got. I went to the room at Clove Road. We walked down the steps. We walked across Clove Road. We walked down the path. We stopped at the spot where she fell down and they raped her. Then I walked, because the girls came running later. Somebody ran back to Clove Road and was screaming, they're raping her, they're raping her. And then the girls came running down and they regrouped and they dragged their body up to a little cement block. And they left her there in the dirt when the ambulance came. And then the girls were there. And we walked down the path. We walked up to the cement block. We walked down by the track. And it really connected with their recollection. I mean, bringing a victim to the scene of a crime is a very valuable tool. Police officers have been doing it for generations, and they should continue doing it because it really does act as a cue or a prompt into the memory of the witness. And in that case, those young women had already made statements. They told me and the detectives, what happened. But when I took that statement and went down there with them, I could have wrote 5 more pages of memories that they had. And I did. And I had a detective with me from my office, and we took notes, and we expanded upon what they experienced. And we gave it to the jury, whatever we could. So that's recognition memory, okay? Recall memory is tell me what happened. Recognition memory is tell me what happened when the girl passed out on the ground and the men began to take off her clothes. That's a question acting as a prompt. Bringing them physically to the scene is a prompt. Doing a walkthrough at the crime scene is a prompt. Both the question, tell me what happened when she passed out and hit the dirt and the men began taking off her clothes, that's a cue, C-U-E, or prompt. So is physically bringing them there, not even saying a word. Just walk with me where they walked, ladies. Stop where they stopped. Walk back to the cement block where you dragged the girl. Just that process acted as a prompt and a cue. Recall memory, recognition memory. They recognized sensorily, through their senses, as well as the questions that we asked, aspects of past events. And the past event here was the assault of this young woman. Recall, recognition, memory. Any questions about that? I want to introduce you to another kind of memory that comes up in child maltreatment cases. We call it scripted memory. Scripted memory. Sometimes things happen in our lives repeatedly in extremely similar ways for long periods of time. They are events that happen so often and so repeatedly that it is very difficult to tell the difference between one or the other. We remember these things, but we remember them in a different way. We remember them the way they usually happen. We don't remember any particular incident over any other incident. So, for example, as Professor Bourg suggests, brushing your teeth, getting ready for bed, maybe even football practice. If you practice 4 days a week and 6 days a week in the summer, one practice seems like any other practice. If you dance or play the guitar, you may go to your guitar teacher 5 days a week or 4 days a week, or even 3 days a week throughout the year. And you don't remember one practice from any other practice, in most cases. So what you remember is how it usually happens. Now, if one day you're brushing your teeth and the mirror explodes, and there's broken glass all on the floor, you may have a distinct, discrete, separate memory for that toothbrushing event. But most of the time, they happen so repeatedly, and one is so indistinctive from the other, that you don't have a discrete, what we call discrete or separate memory. Can someone give me an example how that might happen in a child maltreatment case? Why do we even care about this kind of memory in a child maltreatment case? Is this a memory that children might have that's relevant to child maltreatment investigations?
It can happen repeatedly over and over and over.
Yeah, what, give me an example from your practice of something that might have happened to a kid repeatedly over and over where they can't remember any one from the other, but it happened.
And they were beaten repeatedly?
Corporal punishments, what are you talking about? I always get beat when I don't follow the rules.
What about, the time you got beat with a hanger?
Well, like I said, with the mirror crashing, if something's different about it, you may be able to recall that particular memory, but if it happens so repeatedly and so similarly, it's hard to pull out any one memory from the other. They kind of merge into one another, none more distinct than the other. So you say, I can't tell you how. I want to know how you got beat with the switch. Let's say Dad disciplines the child with his belt, and he's always whipping me with the belt. I don't know. You're asking me the time on Christmas? Or Christmas Eve, I just don't remember that time. I remember what he usually does. It's almost always the same thing. So that's a good example of physical abuse. But that wouldn't cause so many problems as a different kind of abuse might. You had your hand up.
I was going to say, like, if you have a child whose father comes in their room, like, after drinking at night to molest them.
Yeah.
Something like that.
And you were going to say, go ahead.
I was gonna say the same thing, like in Central was, would it be considered, let's say it happens all the time, the time that it didn't happen?
Well, listen, if you could differentiate one from the other, you're doing good. You're pulling it out of the scripted memory, and that's good. And then you would focus on that. We'll talk about how to approach scripted memories in a second, but I'm trying to get an example of scripted memory that happens in our child abuse cases, and we got 2 of them, and that's pretty good. Somebody else got a little different flavor of that one? I mean, how many cases have you had? Well, I don't know how many of you had. I don't know how many I've had either. They always happen the same way. Many, many cases of child sexual abuse involve a child saying something like this. And then in the 6th grade, he began putting his mouth on my body and then began making me fellate him, perform oral sex on him. What was in the 6th grade? Yes. And did he ever put his, was there ever a time, forgetting about the quality of my questions, but did it ever change the sexual intercourse? Not till I was a junior in high school. So from the 6th grade until the 11th grade, he would make you put your mouth on his penis and you would perform oral sex. He would have you perform, that's right. 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade. We're talking 4 years now. In some children's lives, and you were tapping right into it, Dad comes in the room drunk, not drunk, whatever, and you ask the kid, when did it happen? All the time. Well, this is not all the time. Every night? Well, not every night, but it felt like every night, almost every night. I don't know. It just, whenever he could, whenever Mom wasn't around. Something like that happens so often and so similarly when he'd crawl in the bed and do the same thing over and over, year after year, that the child's unable to differentiate one from the other. That's what we call chronic abuse, right? It happens all the time, over and over again. And we see that a lot with sexual abuse of children, where they're molested in a similar way. So tell me about when you had to put your mouth on his penis. Well, he would shut the door, and he'd pull down his shades, and he'd turn the music up real loud. If you were able to say to her, are you telling me about a specific incident? No. Well, what are you telling me? Well, just like it usually happened. That's what he would usually do. Well, can you tell me about one incident that's different from the... No, they're all the same. That's what he would always do. Well, I'm trying to find out about when you lived in the house on Chauncey Street. He would come in, pull down a shade, turn on the music. Well, did he do it when you lived in that house? He did it always the same way. You know, you follow that they can't just pull out one incident for us? That's scripted memory. Now, if it happened once or twice, we're not talking scripted memory. It has to happen over and over again for a sufficient period of time for one event to blur into the next event. And that's what happens to these kids. So how do we approach that? We're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but one thing that we can do is say, did it ever happen different? You said he would usually turn up the radio, pull down the shades, make me put on my robe. You said he would do all those things. Was there a time that it happened differently? Okay. Well, one time it happened in the shed. Tell me about that. You know? And in all those cases, and I told my detectives this and continue to emphasize this, if a guy is that bold that he would do this from the 6th grade to the 11th grade, rest assured there's one time where it doesn't fit the script. One time where he's driving her to 7-Eleven to get some ice cream, when he pulls him back at a 7-Eleven, or one time when, he's got to go check out the shore house because somebody might have broken into it, and he goes, oh, let's get come on, Gabriella, jump in the car. And Gabriella's got a thought bubble on her head. I don't want to go with him. But she winds up going with him, and it happens in the car down the shore. Those are the kinds of things you got to kind of tease out from these script memories to get an incident where you can get some sufficient level of detail about a specific incident. It doesn't create problems, generally speaking, but you need to just be mindful of it. Is the kid talking about a particular incident or how it usually happened? And you can say to a child, listen, you may not remember one incident over the other. Tell me how it usually happened. And that's okay. What would he, well, you usually do this, you usually do that. Then you work on pulling out incidents. The time at the 7-Eleven, the time when he took you down the shore, the time where it happened in front of the fireplace, the time that he, tried to use a condom and it didn't work. And these are cases I got in my brain from real life cases, and did he ever use a condom again? No, it was just this one time. Well, what happened? He didn't like the way it felt, and we threw the condom and the package in the fireplace. All right, tell me all about that time. Now we got one incident, narrowing it down to one incident can be important for criminal prosecution. Not so much for child protection. Not so much for child protection. And prosecutors can get away with how it usually happened sometimes. But we always like to pull out one or two, and if you try hard enough, you'll find one or two where we're talking about an incident rather than the way it usually happened. Many of you, if not all of you, have Professor Freed after this. Professor Freed will be talking about a case called State in the Interest of KAW. KAW. That's a case where scripted memory was involved, where it happened so often and so similarly that the kid couldn't put a date on it. And the Supreme Court of New Jersey gives suggestions about how to narrow it down for the child. And you guys are very comfortable doing this. You do it all the time. You try to anchor their experience in the summer. Was it during school? Was it in the break? Was it in a house you lived in or some other house? And I mentioned this last week where I talked about the different bikes that the little girl had in the Waldron Scott prosecution, the freeholder's husband. We were able to narrow it down based upon a bike that Grandpa gave her. But you try to anchor it in time based upon something that is important in that child's life or landmarks in the child's life. Well, that's a way of teasing out an event from scripted memory. So you want to press Freed a little bit, tell them that this must be a form of scripted memory here, this KW case, and it was. Any questions about scripted knowledge? All right. Now, the overriding issue here for us in Learning Module 4 is suggestibility. And we're going to talk about different contexts where suggestibility is more powerful than others. People, and especially children, are more resistant to suggestibility, as you might guess, if they're questioned at or about the time something occurred. Excuse me. Do we have that luxury in child maltreatment? No. Once in a blue moon, maybe, but very rarely, because kids delay reporting. Okay, so usually we get the case that happened a long time ago. Maybe a week ago, usually months ago, sometimes years ago. Excuse me. Nevertheless, if you had a child who was molested by dad on Saturday and you were interviewing the child on Monday, they are less likely to be suggestible because it just happened, and if we throw something out at them that's wrong, they're less likely to agree with us. They're less likely to be suggestible. That's what Professor Bourg's saying here. In the opposite way, as memory fades, individuals are more susceptible to suggestive questioning. And memories of similar experiences may blend together. That's kind of a problem with scripted recall too, right? When you got these multiple toothbrushings or molests, they kind of blend together. That's why we, at best, can find out how it usually happened. We're talking about something a little bit differently here. We're talking about as time goes on, as time between the event and the interview increases, the more likely that a kid or an adult, but a kid, we're concerned with children, might be susceptible to suggestive questioning. So, as memory fades, people become more susceptible to suggestive questioning. And there are a few other things that make it more likely that someone is suggestible. Generally speaking, we know that preschoolers are more suggestible than grade school kids. Take that to the bank. Preschoolers, more suggestible than grade school kids. Grade school kids, more suggestible than high school kids. High school kids, no more suggestible than adults. Grade school ends for the purpose of suggestibility at 10 or 11. Just about between the 10th and the 11th year, the normal functioning child becomes no more suggestible than adults. So preschoolers more suggestible than grade school more suggestible than adults or high school. So we know that the longer amount of time that passes between the event and the questioning, the more suggestible the interviewee is, or the person being questioned is. We know that if it's a preschooler, they're more suggestible. If it's a preschooler who's interviewed a long time after the event happened, we got like a double issue of suggestibility. They are very vulnerable to suggestion, right? Because these are higher suggestibility contexts I'm giving you. So age. Now, some kids may be better than others. It doesn't mean we're doomed. You know, some preschoolers can get it right. Some, high school kids can get it wrong. But generally speaking, as kids get older, they become more resistant to suggestion, and the younger kids are more vulnerable to suggestion. One of the reasons why children are more vulnerable to suggestibility is because they forget things faster than adults. Okay? Trace strength, we talked about earlier, is just really memory for details. Well, if you have good trace strength, if your memory for details is good, you're less likely to be suggestible. But kids lose that trace strength, they lose that strong memory more quickly than adults. Their memory fades more quickly than adults. Again, probably starting with the same kind of paradigm. Preschoolers forget more quickly than grade school kids, who forget more quickly than high school kids. So when that memory degrades or you forget, there are more blanks that can be filled in by the interviewer. Does that make sense? If you got a very strong memory of what happened, it's a lot harder for an interviewer to influence your recollection. But as memory fades, was the air conditioner on? The brain goes, geez, I don't know, I don't remember. I probably would have remembered if you asked me the next day. But now much time has gone by and I don't remember much at all. In that scenario, the interviewer can fill in that blank. And it was hot that day and the air conditioner must have been on. Isn't that right, little girl? Yeah, it was. A kid who's lost details is more likely to have those details filled in by the interviewer than someone who has a strong recollection of the details. And generally speaking, smaller children and children less than 10 or 11 forget faster than grown-ups. Therefore, they're more likely to be suggestive because there's more blanks to fill in. We don't know about traumatic events. Some people have hypothesized that traumatic events are better remembered. You might slip on the ice here and next week forget you even slipped on the ice. If you fell on your butt and nothing got hurt. If you fell and split your head open, you might remember that better, or maybe not. People speculate that traumatic memories are stronger, but we still don't know. That would be important because then the argument might be that children who are sexually assaulted have experienced a traumatic event, so we can accept their memories of the sexual abuse as more reliable than their memories of a visit to the zoo because traumatic memories are better remembered. But we can't say that because the jury is still out on whether there's research that suggests that traumatic memories are better remembered, and there's research that suggests that traumatic memories are suppressed or they're not remembered as well. Bruck gives us a nice example here. They did some experiments. They gave incorrect information to children immediately after an event, while their memory was still strong, and they didn't bite. Even the little kids were much less likely to adopt the suggestion. But as time goes on, the memory fades, and there's a lot of blanks on what the details were. It's a trouble area. Kids will fill in the blanks with the investigator's suggestion. Professor Bourg makes the observation here that communication is impaired if the child doesn't understand the question. I think that's self-evident, right? Or the child understands it but can't formulate a reply. Or the interviewer doesn't understand the child's reply. And those are linguistic breakdowns. That's what I talk about in Children and Language in last week's class and the PowerPoint that I posted for you to listen to. That's one example of how there's a breakdown between the interviewer and the child. And it's not so much about suggestibility, but it's about miscommunication. So it seems self-evident that if the kid doesn't understand the question, you're going to have an inaccurate communication. So there needs to be some way that the child can communicate effectively with the adult. And sometimes language gets in the way if we don't use it properly or we're not paying close attention. I remember saying that I'm holding my hands extended, that almost always we don't have a perfect connection with a child, but we kind of start out like this. The kid is here and we're up here. We want to try to get it closer so that we're communicating as much as possible on the child's level. One of the things, and one of the chapters might be named this, but it really highlights, and one of my favorite things to say, it really highlights the issues that we encounter in forensic interviewing. Children know more than they can tell. Children know more than they can tell. Even preschoolers. And there's pretty strong research that tells us that 4-year-olds remember stuff. They're at a disadvantage because they can't communicate as well as adults can. They don't have the universe of language and life's experience to put what they experienced in an adult-like context, to put it in a narrative or tell the story about what happened. But if their brain was a hard drive or a recorder and we're able to pluck it out of their head and rewind it, we go, there's the memory. That now we know exactly what happened. They have that memory, but to take that memory from the storage phase and enter the retrieval phase, it's very difficult for small children. They know it, but it's hard to tell. So we have to work on that. We have to give them the opportunity to express themselves and tell us what happened in a way that's developmentally respectful to the child. I talked to you about source monitoring, and that is the perspective for the day, right? Can someone tell me, since I did it last week, what we mean by source monitoring and more specifically source misattribution? We worry about source misattribution when we interview children. And if a child gives a detailed account of dad putting an object into her anus, but there's a source misattribution problem with that account, what do I mean? What do I mean by source misattribution? She gave a good narrative, but we have a source monitoring problem here, and I think it's source misattribution. What does that mean?
Like asking the right questions in the right way? How you ask a question?
No, this is more about the child or the witness's memory. Someone else? What do we mean by source misattribution?
Is it the object that makes it?
I'm sorry, I'm
sorry. The
hands in
object
front of your mouth.
probably,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
The object that was probably used during the story that was given?
No, but the story, she's given a story, she's talking about an object, but there's a source monitoring problem here, and I think we may have an example of source misattribution. Come on, man, I deconstructed the word misattribution. Attribute means to cite something as the source of something. If you got the source wrong.
So maybe that's what source monitoring, maybe in the child telling of the event, she's not telling it, or he or she's not telling it accurately enough?
She's not telling it accurately.
No. Oh, okay, no.
No, go ahead. I think you got it.
It's who you put in front of the, like, if I'm saying, if Eugene is the source.
Oh, no. You're right, but you're talking about something else. You're talking about the active voice and the passive voice.
Okay.
But that's good. The actor has to be at the beginning of the sentence. But don't forget that one. But no, this is about the source. Source of what? Source of the memory, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, in my example, a little girl gives a very detailed account. Daddy came in the room, he took my Lego blocks, he made me pull down my pants and panties, and he stuck it in my butt, and I didn't like the way it felt. Hey, that's a good narrative. It's a crime. It's a child maltreatment. Got to protect the child. But we've identified a source misattribution. The kid tells a story, but what do we mean by source misattribution?
The it?
Let me rewind.
Yeah.
Remember my story about the and you had to read it for today, the key in the outlet?
Yeah.
Okay. I tell that story to my friends at work, right? As if I experienced it.
Oh, the way that it's.
Where did I get it from?
Your mom,
My mom. Why?
because she told you it happened.
Right. Over and over again, right?
Right,
So the source of my memory is wrong. Source misattribution means I got a memory, but the source of it is wrong. So in the girl's account of being anally penetrated, go ahead.
I was gonna say, is it they asked the wrong? Is it like how they asked the question? Like they asked the wrong questions, or?
No, that's what I just said.
Well, the mistake in source monitoring could be because of the wrong question. Yes, you're both right on that count. But I'm just trying to deal with the general concept.
It's the source, right?
Source misattribution.
Isn't it like, I'm able to identify all the who, what, where's, and like where did you get the information, or how did it happen more?
Yeah, forget about who, what, when, and where, and how. Just the memory itself. You have a memory.
Or
Is
who put it there?
It's not
Yeah,
your memory.
right. How did it get there? How did it get there?
Yeah.
Well stated. The two big ways it could have got there are, one, because it really, really happened.
Experience.
You really, really experienced it. That's one way. Yeah, I remember it because it happened. Now, most people who tell us an account of what happened think that they got it because it really happened. But if we were able to peel away the layers of the brain and look from above, one thing could be it really, really happened. What's another way? The child may be very confident about what happened, but they got it not from living it. Someone told it to them. Someone suggested it to them. A parent, a caregiver, a coach. Remember I said most of the time parents don't coach, but they could certainly influence a child's memory by telling the child over and over again how it happened, where the child believes that they experienced it, but it was just suggested to them. One way to think about that is in terms of source monitoring. The ability to see that first sentence up there, the ability to discriminate how, where, or from a piece of information was learned is called source monitoring. Now, children, and she says preschool children, sometimes have difficulty remembering how they acquired information. Consequently, they may not be able to distinguish information they directly experienced from information they were told about. And that is when they get it wrong, where they say, oh, I experienced it, but it was suggested to them and they never experienced it, that would be source misattribution. But the ability to know where you got that information and memory from is called source monitoring. And little kids are poor at source monitoring. They may think they lived it, but mom told them all about it and they never did it. Mom may have talked about going to see the giraffes in the zoo so many times that the kid thinks they went to the zoo once and saw the giraffes, when they never went there at all. They just remember mommy talking about going to the zoo and seeing the giraffes all the time. And when they tell you about going to the zoo and seeing the giraffes, they will say to you, no, I was there, it really happened. That tells us they're not good at source monitoring. They got it wrong. They think they went to the zoo, but it never really happened. And, those are very concrete, ironclad examples. Sometimes it's just nuanced. It's a one minor detail that they think they experienced, and it was suggested to them. There's the belief that anytime there's a penetration, there ought to be blood. And professionals believe that. Now, there could be blood. But it doesn't happen as often as you think, for a variety of reasons. Medically, biologically, it just doesn't happen. But if mom is questioning little Gabriella about, you're saying Uncle Mikey put his finger in your coochie? Oh my God, this is terrible, terrible. Where are your panties from when it happened? That happened last week, Mommy. Where are they? Was there blood on the panties? Huh? There was blood on the panties. Blood on the panties? I'm asking you if there's blood on the panties. I don't know, Mommy. The kid gets interviewed a month later, a week later. Was there blood? Yeah. Now, we would never go, are you sure about that? But, okay, you're telling me that the panties had blood on it? Yet there was blood on the panties. That child thinks there really was blood in the panties. They're not getting it wrong in their mind. Mommy painted a picture of blood so much and so often in the moments and hours after the disclosure that it becomes interwoven in the child's recollection. So the blood on the panties didn't happen. And the statement that it did by the child is an example of source misattribution. The child has that memory. We're not saying she doesn't. The source of the memory is wrong. It's not from seeing the blood in the panties. It's from hearing it from mommy. And little kids have a tough time figuring out what they remember that really happened and what they remember that they saw on TV, they heard mommy say over and over again, they saw it in a movie, their big brother and sister talked about it, they read it in a book. Now, does this happen in every case? No. Is this something that happens, whenever there's a forensic interview? Is this something that is a major problem in forensic interview? No. But it's something we have to be aware of as forensic interviewers. Okay? And the devil's in the details. The more details we get about a child's abusive experience, the more likely we can have confidence that the source is from experiencing it, or rule it out and say, you know what, this kid, she may have been molested, but this part of it's wrong for some reason. This might be the result of mom questioning the child. And there's nothing wrong with moms questioning their kids. I'd question my kid. We don't judge these things, they happen. And we try to figure out, how to deal with them. And we try to learn as much as we can so that we can defend our interviews. And explain that, no, this wasn't source misattribution. This kid really experienced it, because we asked a number of follow-up questions, and they were all consistent, or however you approach dealing with the argument that the child got it wrong. You'll see, I'm going to talk a little bit about, and I think Freed talks about this as well, State versus Kelly Michaels, where source misattribution was front and center. Professor Bourg mentioned something here. See this word imagine? There was a time where mental health professionals, psychologists, and psychotherapists were questioning children about past abuse, and they'd say something like, tell me everything that happened when Grandpapa took you in the shed. And they would remember a little bit. But we want more. We want more details. And then they'd ask the question a different way. Some therapists would say, Gabriella, imagine that you're in the shed right now, and imagine Grandpa's going up and getting the cream from the cabinet, and imagine he's putting on his hands. Think about that. Imagine that. What happened next? No. Get the word imagine out of your vocabulary when you're a forensic interviewer. Don't ask kids to speculate. Don't have pictures in their heads. Don't play the picture in the head game, those kinds of things. Here's one example where the research tells us that among children and adults, source monitoring difficulties are especially pronounced if one imagines doing something. Right? So that process that I just described to you of having the kid imagine can cause the child to have a false memory or an issue of source misattribution. So that's why we avoid imagining, among other reasons.
Can that be like a leading investigation?
Can that be?
Leading? Like?
Well, I don't know if it's leading in my example with the imagining stuff, because if the child testified or explained in the forensic interview that Grandpa did all these things, that wouldn't be leading because she already said it, and I'm just repeating to her what she said, but then I want her to imagine things. Once you tell them to use their imagination, it becomes problematic, and it's hard to tease away the difference between what they imagined and what really happened, especially for little kids. She says this problem is more pronounced for children than adults. Of course, among older children, it's a little less pronounced, but it's still a problem. Now, defense lawyers and those who want to undermine the credibility of children, they love this stuff here because they want to point out that the child could have filled in the blanks based upon what the interviewer said. One of the red herrings that defense lawyers throw out a lot is, and mothers who are coaching their kid to exonerate daddy might say, just go in there and say you dreamt it. Okay, when there's a recantation, sometimes kids come in, sadly, in about 1/5 of cases, and they want to take it back. We'll talk more about that and how children experience abuse with the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. But Professor Bourg is debunking this dream thing. You know, I've had many cases where the kids come in and they try to take it back and they say, I dreamt it, or I fantasized about it. One of the major problems with that kind of defense is humans rarely fantasize about things where they are the central character in the fantasy and negative things happen to them. I don't know about most people, but, I don't fantasize about getting run over by a car or fantasize about splitting my head open. And I certainly don't fantasize about some other human coming and putting their body parts in my body parts. Okay? And it's just not a kind of fantasy that makes sense. And dreams are the cousins of fantasy in a way. And, as Bourg points out, unless they were witnesses to an extended period of adult sexual activity, it's hard to have a dream about sexual activity which has any degree of credibility, especially if the child's original account was pretty detailed. It's hard to dream about those things in a way that has any degree of detail. And it's just it's a developmentally inappropriate dream too. It's pretty hard to have a dream about that. It just doesn't happen. But the defense lawyers would like us to believe that, and that's one way that kids could be coached to recant or retract their statements. Like teenagers could have those dreams, but the younger kids, it doesn't make much sense. Professor Bourg argues that during an interview we might want to say, well, did you see that happen, or did somebody tell you that? Especially if they're a witness to activity. Did you see Grandpa touching Danielle, or did someone tell you about it? That's one way to try to deal with potential source monitoring issues. Bourg makes an observation in subpart 16 here. Interviewers are unlikely to provoke a false report with a single leading question. Clearly, even multiple leading questions. Leading questions are a necessary part of forensic interviewing, especially with small children. Leading questions are a way to cue a child, help them remember past events, and sometimes we need to do that. Can we ask all leading questions? No. Can we ask a majority of leading questions? No. What we want to avoid completely are misleading questions. Okay? You told me Grandpa put his mouth on your butt. Did he also put his wiener in your butt? And that's a leading question that's about a critical issue that you wouldn't want to ask. Okay? But a leading question like, tell me more about that. Did Grandpa ever do something different to your body? You said Grandpa put his mouth on your butt. Did Grandpa ever put something different on your butt? Did Grandpa ever use a different part of his body on your butt? These are ways that you can cue a small child but not give them the answer. It's mildly leading in that it suggests that something else happened to their butt, but it certainly doesn't give them the ultimate answer. Those kind of things are necessary and normal. And one or two bad questions, or even 4 or 5, are not going to result in a false memory of a child. You'll see, I don't know if it's this week or next week, you'll see when Billy gets his finger caught in the mousetrap, how much work it was to create that false memory. Oh, he has a false memory, but it was a lot of work. And it wasn't 4 or 5 misleading, or leading questions. Yeah, we'll talk more about this research. Sam Stone, we're going to see the Sam Stone study in a little bit. Coached or intentionally misled, I talked about that last week. Biased interviewing, I'm going to talk about in a different context. Okay, any questions about the memory issues? It doesn't say it here, it's in one of the other things. You need to know this too. Children are more suggestible about peripheral details than central details. Children are more suggestible about peripheral details than they are about central details. What do I mean by that? And then we're going to take a 10-minute break.
What's more around them?
Say that again?
What's more around them?
What is what's more around them mean?
And
What are
their
you trying to
environment,
communicate?
kind of what
Okay.
they can take a look at from this vision, kind of.
Okay, let's go back to my assertion. Children are more suggestible about peripheral details than the central details. Imagine a child is sexually molested by her grandfather in the back of a minivan. Give me an example of a central detail to the molestation.
What's in the back? What's next to her?
No.
The minivan?
Oh,
No, the central detail to her abusive experience. What happened to her? What's a central important detail? One that's...
she was molested.
Give me he put his penis into her butt, okay? We're using very generic terms, we have to be specific. He put his penis into her butt. That's a central detail, would you agree?
Yeah.
That's a major thing. Whether the light was on or off in the dome in the front of the van would be what? Peripheral. Peripheral detail. Right? So that's what we mean by central details are the big important details. So a girl is assaulted, sodomized, sexually molested in a minivan. The fact that he put his penis in her butt, what it felt like on her body, whether he held her down, those would be considered central details. Whether the light was on or off in the minivan, whether they parked near the bus stop in the back of the empty mall or not would be peripheral. What color socks he was wearing would be peripheral. The minor details. Sometimes what's minor to the interviewer isn't minor to the court or to anybody else. So what color socks may be relevant. Maybe that's the way they ID'd the guy. So the cops are really interested in what color socks he had on because they found them in his drawer and it was an unknown assailant. Who knows? The point, though, is the kid's more suggestible about those minor details. Well, little girl, when Grandpa was assaulting you, the truck was running, right? It was turned on and the engine was running? Yeah, it was. That's a minor detail. If he said, and Grandpa put his wiener in your ear too. No, he didn't. He put it in my butt. They're not going to, that central detail, they're not going to fall prey to your suggestion. Not always, but I'm saying when we compare what they're most suggestible to, the central detail they're pretty strong on. No, he put his wiener in my butt. Okay. And the truck was running. Yeah, the truck was running. You want the truck running? Yeah, the truck was running, It doesn't work that way. I'm being silly to make the point here. Whether the light was on or off, the door was partially open or closed, whether the truck was running or not, whether it was a rainy day or a dry day, kids are more likely to adopt what the interviewer suggests on those peripheral details than on the central details. Does that make sense? Yeah, I think so. All right, let's take a 5-10 minute break to 7:30, and then we'll talk more about this.
Are you saying central or essential?
Oh, yeah, I gotta speak better.
Essential?
No, central. Central, yeah, central, not essential.
Central, like.
Central, like
Like
Central,
Central Park.
Grand Central Park.
Park.
Central
Oh,
Park.
I got
Central? Central? Central. Central.
Gotcha.
Sounds like a.
Withdraw.
Okay, this is part 2 of
Here's the out of gift box, right?
Monday, February 24, 2014 class. We began learning Module 4. I want to pick up with the PowerPoint on memory and suggestibility. Among your learning Module 4 assignments are the PowerPoint that I'm going to begin discussing with you in a moment. And I have it here under the line required viewing. There's a PowerPoint that's narrated that you watch. And it's essentially what I'm going to be talking about in a moment, as well as this video that we'll view next week called Out of the Mouth of Babes from ABC News 2020. So that PowerPoint, or this PowerPoint right here, is also narrated and on YouTube for you to watch in its entirety. And this is applying what we just talked about and more in our practice. That is, understanding and respecting the potential for children to be influenced by investigative questioning, that is memory and suggestibility in children. And the question becomes, through our interviewing, can we get a child to say or believe something that is not true? What do you think?
Yes.
Yeah, we can, and that's the danger. We want to make sure that the child's recollection is based upon having experienced an event rather than having it suggested to them through some other mechanism other than having experienced it. This is a photograph of a home up in Massachusetts that I took a few years back. You're going to have a discussion forum where you get into some degree of detail about this issue, and it has to do with the early days of suggestibility in the courtroom. And this woman, Rebecca Nurse, lived in that house outside of Salem Village in Massachusetts, and that is the Salem witch trials. You saw a clip from a Hollywood movie about the Salem witch trials. It's actually The Crucible. And you're going to get into discussion about that, but that is, in part, the historical context of suggestibility. The Salem witch trials, Sigmund Freud also played a role in children's suggestibility. Sigmund Freud had believed, much to the consternation of his colleagues in Austria and throughout Europe when he was practicing psychiatry, that many of the women who came to him who had mental health problems and neuroses, he believed that these issues in functioning as an adult and functioning with intimate partners were based in part on their reports of childhood sexual victimization, that they were victims of incest and intrafamilial abuse. Unfortunately, he didn't get a warm reception among his colleagues, and he retooled that theory, and he set children and women back many, many years when he said that the women patients that he was dealing with, their neuroses were based in part upon fantasies of being molested as children, that they in fact weren't molested, but they fantasized about it. And that did a disservice to women and children for many years after that. And for many years, prosecutors did not charge these crimes because they worried about suggestibility. They worried about whether kids and women fantasize about these things or get it wrong. And they didn't charge in part because they thought these were really family problems. They weren't criminal problems. And they were skeptical of the truthfulness of these allegations, that they were very difficult prosecutions. But throughout the years, things changed, and prosecutors now treat these kind of offenses as crimes. Some of what Freud had postulated back then has been thoroughly debunked. You know, and the Salem witch trials are just something that happened many years ago, but continues to act as a metaphor for a system run amok, a system that got it wrong. Because in the Salem witch trials, the accusations were 100% wrong, because we all know there are no such thing as witches. So people were accused of sorcery and witchcraft, and that's why this is an indelible fact of American jurisprudence or the American court system, because it was so dramatic. You had 19 people who were accused of witchcraft, and they got due process. They went to trial. There were judges and lawyers appointed, and the rules of evidence applied. And they were convicted after trial largely on the words of children. And the children couldn't have gotten it more wrong, because they were 100% innocent, yet they met their death and were hanged because they were convicted of sorcery. And today we worry about children and their testimony in the courtroom and whether they got it right or not. And in some ways, the Salem witch trials are a sad but true analogy that are often applied to child abuse investigations. When you look at jurors' perceptions, how the average person thinks about kids, they're a bit conflicted. Many people think that kids are trustworthy, honest, and innocent. But they also have this competing belief that children have poor cognitive ability, that their brains don't work as well as adults, and they are not resistive to suggestion. And there's some truth in that. We just talked about how preschoolers and grade school kids are more vulnerable to suggestion than adults. So the question becomes, how suggestible are they? In what context are they suggestible? What does the research say about suggestibility? Well, prior to 1979, there wasn't very much research at all, but between 79 and 92, there were more than 100 studies on children and suggestibility. And interestingly, most of the literature was pro-child, in the sense that the outcomes showed that children were not that suggestible, that they were not as easily influenced as people thought. Most of this research was done by a woman named Gail Goodman and some of her colleagues. And I gave you a list of more recent research on this area, in this area. One of the studies was this clown study, and this was a study where pairs of kids between the ages of 4 and 7, the most vulnerable ages, went into a trailer where there was a man dressed as a clown, and there were two kind of subjects. One child interacted with the clown, and the other one watched. And the children were asked leading questions about the clown. He took your clothes off, didn't he? They're not even leading, they're misleading questions. And not one of the children who interacted with the man made a false report. And one of the bystander kids, one of the kids who were simply watching, only one of them made a false report saying that they were spanked. Again, the outcome was that the kids were pretty good. They didn't succumb to these kinds of questions. He took your clothes off, didn't he? Now, one of the things about research into forensic interviews of children who may have been sexually abused, one of the difficulties is what we call ecological validity. And there may be a slide on it in a little while, but I'll give you the definition right now. Ecological validity is the degree with which the experiment mirrors real life. So we're trying to figure out, are children suggestible about sexual abuse by someone they know and trust? Are children suggestible about being sexually abused? Now, we can never recreate that, right? We can't abuse kids and then question them about it and see whether they're right or wrong, or whether they're easily misled or easily suggested or not. So they try to create experiments that mirror that. And the notion of ecological validity is, does this experiment what really happens to kids? Well, first of all, the clown study, we could argue, has poor ecological validity. One, I think it's safe to assume that, at least in part, sexual abuse of a child is a traumatic event for the child. It's a non-consented to touching or penetration. Having a clown make balloons for you, or putting a sticker on you, or doing some silly game with you is very dissimilar to being sexually abused by your grandfather or your uncle or your teacher, right? So they don't line up too well. So when we're drawing conclusions about this clown study, we have to be mindful of the fact that the design of the study doesn't bear a strong enough similarity to what happens in real life for it to be of much value. It might be of some value, but not much. I mean, Grandpa or Uncle Mike is different from the clown. The child has no interest in the clown. It's not their father or their grandfather or their teacher or somebody that they might have a relationship with and a certain amount of loyalty 2. It's somewhat interactive. Obviously, sexual abuse is interactive because one human does something to another human's body. So it's somewhat interactive in that the clown interacts with the child. But it is flawed at its inception from an ecological validity standpoint because it's a non-traumatic event involving someone that the kid has no special relationship with. And those are the kind of cases that we're concerned about. Kids who are molested by people they know and often love. So Goodman and her colleagues came up with another study, right? And the clown, it was not a traumatic event with balloon animals and stickers and that kind of thing. So Goodman and her colleagues, in an attempt to create more ecological validity, came up with this medical exam study. And here they had 72 kids who were not abused. They were female, between 5 and 7. And among that group, half of them had a scoliosis exam, which is an examination of the back, the end of the issue. It's an exam of the back to see if they have certain curvature of the spine. The other half had a genital exam, where a physician looked at their genitals and did some medical evaluation. They were asked open-ended questions. Not one child made a false report. Only 22% even mentioned the genital touch among the group where the doctor touched their vaginas. When they were asked direct questions, the genital group, remember half the group had a back exam, half the group had a vaginal exam. When the vaginal group was asked directly about genital touch, between 14 and 21% failed to reveal genital touching. And among the scoliosis group, you had a 6% false report, which obviously is troubling. 6 out of 100 said that their genital was touched, and when in fact their back was touched. The questions were like follows. How many times did the doctor kiss you? Questions like that. Not one of the 7-year-old made a false report. Among the 5-year-olds, there were 215 questions like that were similar and suggestive, and only 3 times did a child agree that the doctor kissed them or touched them on their body. Now, 3 times is too much because it never happened. But we're trying to figure out what the numbers are, what the percentages are of kids who are asked highly leading questions. What are the percentages of children who make a false assertion? What's interesting here is, starting out with the genital group, more than three quarters of the children never reported that their vaginas were touched. And they were asked about it in a bunch of different ways, and they didn't say anything about it. When they were directly asked, did the doctor put his hands on your privates, on your vagina, whatever the kid perceived as a description of their private parts, specifically their vaginas, up to 21% still failed to reveal genital touching. Almost a quarter of them, when asked directly, did the doctor touch your private parts, said no. So we're trying to figure out how many kids are going to say that they had their private parts touched when they never had their private parts touched, and the numbers were very low, 3% or 6% rather. But one thing we learned here was kind of the opposite. Among the girls who had their vagina touched, when first asked, over 75% of them didn't say that their vagina was touched. And when asked pointed, direct questions, still about a quarter of them said, no, he didn't touch my vagina. What might we learn from this experiment, this research, that's a little bit of the flip side of what we were expecting to learn? We're expecting to learn about how many times kids make a false report of genital touching. Instead, we learned a little bit about that and a lot about how many times children, despite being touched on their privates, don't tell us about that. Right? What do you think the reason is that these little girls didn't mention it and would still deny it after they watched through two-way mirrors? What's one lesson we can take from this about?
Some kids just don't report it.
That's right. and they don't report something very specific. What is the specific thing that they're not reporting?
Sexual abuse?
Something else.
Well, this wasn't sexual abuse, but that
The thing they know might be wrong.
that their vaginas were touched, right? Which is very similar to sexual abuse, except that this was a doctor doing it for innocent purposes. And now we're getting to why might that be? Someone just said something.
Because they know it's wrong, or they might think it's wrong.
Well, maybe they think it's wrong.
But I think that they probably feel like it might be normal because a doctor's doing it.
Well, no one asked them to judge right or wrong. They simply asked whether he did it or not.
Oh, okay.
And they said no, some of them. What is it about that kind of inquiry or questioning that you might get that kind of response?
They may be embarrassed.
They might be embarrassed.
Yeah.
They might be scared. They might think that he did something wrong, which was suggested over there by
Or
Jennifer.
maybe when we ask touch, they probably feel like maybe touched the wrong way.
Again, yeah, maybe not wanting to get the doctor in trouble or think we mean by touch the wrong way. Yeah.
What about the, source monitoring? Maybe it was already suggested, or, you know, 'cause I'm a mother, and I tell my kids about good touch, bad touch.
Right.
So maybe it was already gone over with them, you know, in their own personal lives about good touch, bad touch. So they were more willing to just withhold the information. That's what Jennifer said, because it felt inappropriate.
Yeah, maybe they didn't want to get the doctor in trouble or they thought it was wrong. And, you know, it's kind of the opposite message we're teaching. You're teaching your daughter to tell when something happens, not to withhold, right? Right? So that's the message of touch lessons.
Could it be that they had those type of exams already?
I don't know, but still, why would they not tell about the privates? I think you hit it on the head. I don't think there's more to say about this other than there's a certain amount of shame and weirdness and privacy associated with touching our private parts. And I would argue here that this is evidence that people have a disincentive. It's not easy to talk about your private parts to strangers. Even though it really happened, they feel better not talking about it and denying it. That denial, because of perhaps shame, because of being uncomfortable talking about your private parts, because of privacy issues, the very notion of privacy parts here, I think it's real hard and embarrassing to talk about your genitals to strangers. And that's going to happen whether it's a forensic interview or some kind of experiment where it just happened. I mean, there's no evidence that they were uncomfortable. Uncomfortable is my
Is that
judgment.
a built-in mechanism in human beings, maybe? Because as you said that, I thought about Eve, right? I thought about, hell, if I'm 70, I don't want to talk about, I might be, you know.
I agree. No, I think that it's problematic for anybody to talk about that and to discuss it. I think it just might be more pronounced with children. There might be a higher degree of anxiety in talking about their private parts and their sexual parts. You know, it's a highly private, highly personal act that occurred, and then they're being debriefed in this experiment by someone they don't know, and that's just the place they're not going. And I'm suggesting the lesson here can apply to our forensic interviews. You know, we're asking the same kind of questions, and we may get what we call a false negative. A false negative is when people say something didn't happen when it really did. The purpose of this experiment was to see whether there are false positives. False positives are when somebody says, I was touched, when it never happened. Right? A false positive, a child makes a positive statement about sexual abuse when it never really happened. And you want to avoid false positives. People can go to jail for false positives. It's not a good day when, you know, we proceed on the basis of a child's statement that their private parts were touched when it never happened. That's a false positive. And we had 6% false positives here on the scoliosis group. But we also had 21% false negatives. False negative being the children were touched on their privates, and when asked, they said no. And when we're doing forensic interviews of children who've been sexually abused, we need to pay attention to that too. We're looking them in the eye and go, Grandpa, and there are a lot of other things, you know, they have no relationship with the doctor, yet they're still uncomfortable. 21% of them were uncomfortable talking about genital touch. And the doctor's not their father or their uncle or their dad or their stepdad or their mom or mom's boyfriend or somebody that they don't want to get in trouble. So we're learning a little bit here. We're learning about false negatives and false positives. What about its ecological validity? One of the things that we said about the clown study was, balloon animals, stickers, messing around with the clown is not a traumatic event. What about this? Is this going to the doctor? Could that be argued that it's different from the clown study? Is there more anxiety interacting with a clown or a doctor looking at your privates?
A doctor.
Wow.
Yeah, I think a doctor looking at your privates and examining you is a little more.
I don't know.
Is that it?
No, pull down your pants, lay on there, get in the stirrups, put your head back. Is just as innocuous as a clown putting a sticker on you.
I hate clowns, so.
That's true, though. That's something that you need to be mindful of. Some people are scared of clowns. They much rather be in the doctor's office getting examined than deal with a clown. So that's an
I'd
odd.
rather deal with the clown than to be in the doctor's office.
Yeah.
I like doctors.
Well,
I don't know, that's just me.
anyway, the next study that we look at in a little while before we do Kelly Michaels is about an inoculation. So they're trying to create a traumatic and anxiety. You're never going to recreate sexual abuse, but where there's a little anxiety in the process. Clowns, not so much anxiety unless you got a fear of clowns. Doctors, pull down your pants, get over here. Doctors probing your body. A little bit more anxiety, I would argue, for most people than a clown who's making balloon animals for you. But later we do an experiment with Sam Stone. We'll look at next week the inoculation study. Now even today, at 50 years old, I don't want to get shots, okay? I get a little bit of anxiety when the doctor gets the shot out. Let me see that shot, doc. How big is that needle? Right? So there's a little bit of anxiety there. So I would argue that the inoculation study is probably closer to a traumatic event than getting a sticker from a clown. And we'll look at that inoculation study next week as well as the Kelly Michaels case. Okay, any questions about what I talked about? All right.
Supposed to post this Thursday?
Yeah.
Yes.
Look it up. I don't know. I think so.
We are.
This Thursday? Yep.
Yeah, if the discussion board is over Sunday night, then you got to post Thursday night. All your grades should be up to date too.